2 centuries back, this spot was merely a marshy expanse wedged between farmland and a waterway. Now kids everywhere recognize this famed address. Welcome to the White House. Delve into the full chronicle of America's iconic residence, the White House. It has a majestic ring to it, right? Yet beneath its elegant exterior hides a far more complex tale. Presidents didn't construct this home. Instead, it rose through the labor of stoneworkers, enslaved individuals, and immigrants whose identities have faded from collective memory. It endured flames when British troops torched it down to its foundations. It bore witness to Lincoln's restless strides amid the Civil War's endless vigils. It absorbed hushed discussions during the Cuban Missile Crisis as global catastrophe loomed just a breath away. Within its walls, monarchs and tyrants found hospitality. Here, fates were sealed for battles launched and soldiers returned. Official portraits capture grins and lavish rugs. But lurking below are bargains struck in shadows, anxieties, and choices reshaping the destinies of countless souls. So, what truly defines the White House? Merely a splendid dwelling for chief executives, or a quiet observer of the nation's most shadowed truths? To grasp the White House at its core, we must first explore the peculiar decision to situate the U.S. Capitol in such an improbable locale. As with countless chapters in American lore, the explanation boils down to negotiation, partisan maneuvering, and the chaotic process of forging 13 fractious colonies into one unified country. That pivotal summer of 1790 marked the quiet resolution of the Capitol's destiny, not via some visionary blueprint, but through a clandestine supper agreement that endures as a cornerstone of U.S. political legend. Alexander Hamilton, the driven Treasury Secretary, urgently sought backing for his bold fiscal initiative, having the national government absorb the state's debts from the Revolutionary War. Congress had ground to a halt over it, with Southern lawmakers eyeing it as a Yankee power play. Thomas Jefferson, fresh from his French stint as the new Secretary of State, unexpectedly stepped in as mediator. Hosting a discreet meal at his New York City home on Maiden Lane, he united Hamilton and Virginia's powerhouse legislator, James Madison. Their conversation over dinner forged a seminal pact shaping American landscapes. In return for Southern votes to pass Hamilton's debt scheme, the enduring U.S. Capitol would straddle the Potomac River, drawn from lands in Maryland and Virginia, anchoring federal power squarely in the South. This trade-off was no minor yield. Back then, bustling hubs like Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore vied intensely to claim the capital's prestige, boasting ready ports, thriving trade networks, and the comforts of refined society. The Potomac location, however, amounted to little more than brackish wetlands, dense woods, and soggy earth prone to frequent inundations. By today's standards, it screamed inefficiency. Imagine proposing a fresh capital, not amid a thriving metropolis, but in a steamy, bug-plagued lowland far from any meaningful hub. Still, this isolation drew appeal from certain quarters. Southern landowners, George Washington among them, held vast holdings nearby and anticipated windfalls from the inevitable real estate boom. Moreover, erecting a capital anew promised a pristine emblem of Republican purity, free from the taint of urban commerce that critics decried in established towns. Visionaries pictured it as an American Athens, a meticulously designed metropolis of sweeping boulevards and timeless edifices, emerging from the wilds to mirror the fledgling democracy's noble principles. Thus, on July 16, 1790, President Washington enacted the Residence Act, establishing a 10-mile square federal enclave along the Potomac as the government's forever home. Philadelphia would serve as interim capital for about 10 years as the fresh metropolis materialized. Washington gained sweeping powers to pinpoint the precise spot within the zone and direct the design and erection of key public structures. What ensued blended city design with frontier conquest, lofty dreams of grandeur clashing against the harsh grind of muck, illness, and isolation, the young United States was venturing to conjure a capital, virtually from the void in terrain, wholly unsuited to such lofty aims. At the heart of this bold endeavor stood the White House itself. President Washington confronted not merely the placement of structures, but the challenge of crafting a capital that embodied the dignity of a nation, viewing itself as the successor to ancient Republican ideals. To tackle this, he enlisted an individual whose vision aligned perfectly with the project's ambition. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer who had earned acclaim in the Revolutionary War. L'Enfant reached the Potomac site in March 1791, where amid the soggy, irregular terrain, plagued by mud, pools of water, and swarms of insects, others saw obstacles, but he envisioned potential. He dreamed up wide boulevards and expansive theatrical views. The scheme he unveiled to Washington that summer was daring, outlining a city tailored not to the fledgling republic of the present, but to the mighty empire he foresaw in its future. Central to L'Enfant's concept lay a network of streets intersected by striking diagonal thoroughfares, fanning out from focal points to form majestic sightlines reminiscent of Versailles or the grand designs of Baroque Rome. He selected two standout elevations in the area, Jenkins Hill and another ridge about a mile and a half northwest, and designated them as the anchors of Republican authority. The Congress House, known today as the Capitol, would rise on Jenkins Hill, while the president's residence would occupy the northwestern height. L'Enfant stressed that these edifices must offer unobstructed vistas of each other across a vast public expanse, a sightline representing the bond between legislative and executive functions. In his conception, the president's dwelling was to be opulent indeed, a mansion roughly 5 times the size of what was eventually constructed, an expansive layout ideal for official events, social gatherings, and the routine operations of an expanding country. Perched atop its prominence, it would serve as a Republican seat of power, overlooking the Potomac River and the radiating streets leading to it. Sweeping panoramas would extend in multiple directions, enabling the nation's leader, in a symbolic sense, to overlook both the capital and the realm under his brief stewardship. Yet within this ambitious blueprint lurked the roots of L'Enfant's downfall. He balked at altering core features of his design, frequently sparred with the commissioners tasked with managing the city's growth, and demanded the removal of any buildings obstructing his layouts. These conflicts intensified until he unauthorized the raising of a manor owned by Daniel Carroll, relative of a key commissioner. This misstep shattered the fragile balance. By February 1792, just shy of a year since sharing his blueprint, L'Enfant found himself ousted from the effort. Nevertheless, the essence of his ideas endured. The commissioners retained the fundamental pattern of angled straits and the positioning of principal government edifices, while scaling back some of his bolder flourishes. The president's home, in particular, required a more modest reinterpretation, grand enough to convey respectability, yet subdued to avoid any hint of monarchical excess. This ongoing clash between Republican restraint and the demands of national prestige influenced every pivotal choice in the building's architecture. There, the commissioners opted for a decision that profoundly affected the residence's essence, launching a nationwide design contest for the president's house. In March 1792, ads appeared in papers throughout the states, calling on architects and builders to propose designs for a home, accommodating the president, his household, and adequate staff. The award was $500 or an equivalent medal, a handsome sum in those days, though it hardly captured the prestige of shaping the new nation's executive seat. Submissions varied wildly, blending utilitarian proposals with wildly imaginative ones from entrants whose identities have largely faded including a striking anonymous entry later linked to Thomas Jefferson. From this assortment of concepts and aspirations came a victor that would define the visual legacy of the American presidency for generations, albeit in ways unforeseen by entrants or overseers alike. The proposals flooding in during the spring and summer of 1792 offered a revealing glimpse into American notions of presidential living. Beyond mere blueprints, they represented ideological declarations on the scope of executive authority in a republic born from rebellion against tyranny. The Commissioner's guidelines remained intentionally broad, likely by design. The executive residence needed to be spacious, sufficient for hosting formal gatherings and conducting government affairs. However, the precise dimensions were up to the individual architects. It required an air of respectability without veering into extravagance, elegance without evoking monarchy. This vagueness invited a broad array of interpretations for what a Republican leader's dwelling ought to represent. Certain proposals drew deeply from continental European palace styles, featuring extended frontages, various extensions, elaborate decorations, and grand reception areas that might have suited a king's palace. Not surprisingly, these ideas received scant approval from the judges, who were acutely sensitive to claims that the emerging national authority resembled a hidden crown. In contrast, some designs veered toward simplicity, presenting structures so unassuming and basic, they resembled the urban home of a successful trader. Functional, to be sure, but scarcely appropriate for entertaining diplomats or staging official banquets. Among the more captivating submissions was one from an unidentified participant using merely the initials A. The blueprint suggested an expansive villa-style edifice, evidently influenced by Andrea Palladio's Renaissance estates in Italy, complete with a central dome and evenly balanced extensions on both flanks. It demonstrated elegance, precise scaling, and evident expertise from a trained professional. Subsequent inquiries revealed that this mysterious proposal originated from Thomas Jefferson, who, despite his role as Secretary of State, couldn't help entering his personal concept for the presidential abode. Yet, no matter its polish, the judges viewed Jefferson's creation as fatally flawed. It appeared overly opulent and continental, reminiscent of the elite estates he had encountered in France. Moreover, they likely suspected its authorship. Jefferson's affinity for Palladian elements was well known. Adopting his plan risked seeming partial to an influential official. Dismissing it publicly would spark diplomatic awkwardness. The easiest path was probably the discreet one. Shelve it and proceed. A number of the remaining entries highlighted the constraints of design knowledge in the early United States. The fledgling nation lacked true architects by old-world standards. Most constructors gained experience through on-the-job learning and practical labor, rather than scholarly exploration of ancient principles and harmonies. Consequently, many plans carried a local, unpolished quality, solid and utilitarian, yet lacking the polish and equilibrium that could lend the structure international stature. What the judges truly sought, though they found it hard to articulate, was a concept that navigated an extraordinarily fine line. The executive home must be impressive enough to earn deference from nations accustomed to sovereigns and their opulent courts, while modest enough to convince U.S. citizens that their leader remained one of them, not an aspiring ruler. It should reflect ancient republican ideals, more akin to Rome than Versailles, while serving effectively as a venue for public duties and personal domesticity. Essentially, the structure had to capture the core contradiction of U.S. leadership authority: robust, yet bounded, stately, but egalitarian, enduring, without implying heredity. As the season shifted from summer to fall in 1792, the panel reviewed the entries with mounting irritation. No proposal fully aligned with their ideal. A few nailed certain aspects but faltered elsewhere. The submission period expired without a clear victor. The contest seemed headed for failure, prompting the judges to consider prolonging the solicitation or discreetly dropping it to commission a professional outright. It was precisely amid this indecision that a fresh proposal emerged from an unlikely source. Not a renowned designer from Philadelphia or New York, but an Irish-born constructor based in Charleston, South Carolina. He was James Hoban, and his poised, harmonious concept would ultimately shape the appearance of the American president's residence for over 200 years. The individual whose vision would come to symbolize the nation's premier landmark started his existence as distant from such prestige as imaginable. James Hoban entered the world around 1755 in County Kilkenny, Ireland, within the rural area of Callan, a region of leaseholding farmers, modest dwellings, and winding lanes. It offered scant advantages for a gifted youth lacking influential connections. Mid-18th century Ireland provided few opportunities for advancement, particularly for Catholics constrained by severe penal codes that restricted land ownership, career options, and civic engagement. Nevertheless, Hoban possessed drive and ability. In his youth, Hoban trained under a local builder, gaining practical expertise in stonework and woodworking, while also mastering the finer art of drafting architectural plans. His talent quickly attracted supporters who secured his admission to the Dublin Society's School of Drawing, a place where talented learners explored techniques in architectural sketching, perspective drawing, and the classical elements central to Georgian style. It was during this crucial period in Dublin that Hoban came across a structure destined to profoundly influence his vision. Leinster House, the opulent urban residence of the Duke of Leinster. Finished in 1748 according to plans by Richard Cassels, this edifice exemplified the disciplined grace of Georgian architecture. Built from sturdy stone, it featured meticulous balance, serene ratios, and subtle classical embellishments. It conveyed noble prestige alongside a composed Republican sobriety, steering clear of the ornate excess seen in Baroque estates yet still demanding respect. To Hoban, immersed in studies and probably laboring on similar edifices, Leinster House appeared as an ideal archetype, a form of design that evoked enduring stability and respect without veering into monarchical pomp. Following the American Revolution, a surge of migrants departed Ireland for the fledgling United States, where artisans with expertise were in high demand. Hoban made the voyage across the ocean around the mid-1780s. He first established himself in Philadelphia before heading southward to Charleston, South Carolina, a bustling harbor city fueling a construction surge and reliable contracts. By 1792, Hoban had earned a strong standing in Charleston as a constructor and designer, with notable undertakings to his credit, such as the state capitol, which a subsequent blaze would claim. News of the contest for the president's residence eventually arrived in Charleston, and Hoban saw it as a rare opportunity. He crafted his entry, leaning extensively on recollections of Leinster House, adapting its Georgian harmony and classical moderation to suit an American Republican context. His concept outlined a three-level edifice, including the elevated basement, made of stone and featuring a central portico at the entrance with uniform lines of windows along the facade. At its core, the layout formed an elegant rectangular block. Expansive formal chambers occupied the main level, private living areas sat above, and utility zones lay beneath. It was functional, honorable, and deeply informed by the Irish-Georgian heritage he had soaked up in Dublin. Importantly, Hoban grasped an aspect that eluded numerous rivals: proportion. His creation was substantial yet not imposing, grand sufficient for official gatherings and international affairs, but modest enough to serve as an actual dwelling. In contrast to L'Enfant's vision of a mansion perhaps 5 times grander, or Jefferson's dream of an ornate countryside estate, Hoban's scheme promised feasibility within a sensible budget and schedule, all while lending tangible prestige to the presidency. Moreover, Hoban's approach held a quiet edge, one of deliberate impartiality. It shunned bold aesthetic flourishes that might signal partisan leanings. The Georgian idiom, already commonplace in America through colonial civic structures and homes, came across as conventional rather than novel, timeless rather than trendy, reliable rather than ostentatious, especially amid intense political strife. Such architectural tactfulness was likely just what the judges sought, whether they articulated it or not. As the commissioners gathered in July 1792 to review the submissions, Hoban's entry distinguished itself, not through innovation, but through its skillful execution, straightforwardness, and appropriate scope. President Washington, involved in the ultimate decision, is said to have valued the plan's utility and decorum alike. On July 16, 1792, precisely 2 years after the Residence Act's passage, James Hoban was announced as the competition's victor. He claimed the awarded sum of $500, but of greater value, the contract to supervise building the president's house. This obscure Irish newcomer had claimed the role of defining America's premier emblematic home. The true challenges remained, transforming sketches into solid masonry emerging from a boggy slope along the Potomac. The gap between an exquisite blueprint and a tangible edifice emerging from marshland isn't a matter of mere measurements. It demands countless hours of grueling labor, persistent material shortages, and an unyielding resolve seldom chronicled in accounts of the past. With the commission in hand, James Hoban now faced the task of converting his precise, orderly designs into actual brick and stone on terrain that seemed engineered by the elements to resist at every turn. The formal placement of the cornerstone occurred on October 13, 1792, during a Masonic ceremony conducted by the Georgetown Lodge. The dignified addresses, deliberate movements, and ritual implements lent the occasion a sense of order and unity. In truth, they were marking the launch of an immensely challenging endeavor, on terrain scarcely fit for a simple shed, much less the residence of the nation's leader. The selected spot for the executive's dwelling occupied a gentle slope, far from the striking summit Lant had envisioned, yet elevated sufficiently to provide decent runoff and unobstructed vistas. This minor height advantage would turn out to be vital, given the persistently damp and shifting earth all around. Prior to placing even one base stone, the plot required subduing. Dense forests covered the space, and teams labored for weeks felling timber, uprooting roots, and clearing brush. Next, they tackled smoothing and evening the surface. The grueling task grew even tougher due to the clay-rich dirt, which became a clinging mire after any downpour. Laborers carved out trenches to divert moisture from the eventual cellar area. Yet these conduits demanded frequent unclogging and fixes as the Potomac's yearly overflows challenged each improvised fix. Throughout much of the initial year, digging tools outnumbered carving ones in use. The ground had to be forced into a form that vaguely resembled a stable base for construction. The assembled crew on this slushy knoll mirrored the diverse and unfair landscape of nascent U.S. employment. Hoban recruited a number of expert artisans from Charleston, including Irish and Scottish masons, skilled in working the Aquia Creek sandstone picked for the facade. Their knowledge commanded solid pay for the era, typically over $1 daily, a solid wage in the 1790s. Joining them were regional hands pulled in by reliable income and the uncommon opportunity to claim part in erecting a structure under the nation's gaze. Right from the outset, though, the initiative relied substantially on forced servitude. Facing chronic funds shortages and trouble luring sufficient hands to this isolated, sickly spot, the overseers adopted the go-to method of Virginia and Maryland landowners for mustering large groups. They leased bound individuals from adjacent estates, These laborers were contracted annually or by term. The fees benefited not the toilers themselves, but their self-proclaimed proprietors. Nearly every grueling task burdened enslaved African-American men. Such an arrangement curbed expenses and sustained momentum. Yet it also embedded a harsh reality into the core of the executive's abode. Individuals denied suffrage, citizenship status, property rights, or the liberties the fledgling democracy professed to uphold, were constructing the venue where decrees on their subjugation would originate. The overseer's ledgers meticulously noted sums disbursed to enslavers, but frequently stripped the true laborers to an impersonal, recurring label, Negro hire. Even in records, those whose exertion birthed the building were dehumanized. As the close of 1792 eased into the cold season, groundwork persisted. Teams hollowed out the sub-level destined for cooking areas, pantries, and utility passages. The base barriers rose using nearby rock bound with lime-based cement and erected layer upon layer. Advancement crawled deliberately. Every segment required time to cure before bearing additional load. The frosty months introduced fresh hurdles, sub-zero chills that might split unset binder, limited light for tasks, and the sheer strain of motivating crews outdoors amid biting gusts, chill, and sludge that made each shift a trial of grit. Come the spring of 1793, following over half a year of clearing, excavating, channeling, and positioning concealed masonry, the location hit a pivotal milestone. The cellar's perimeter stood firm. The underpinnings were solid, and the embankment overlooking the Potomac was primed for visible progress. Conditions were ripe for the project's most arduous and prominent stage. Erecting the massive rock barriers that would define the executive's home and etch its profile against the U.S. skyline for generations ahead. Now that the base was stable and the 1793 thaw arrived, focus turned to the labor-intensive, visible work, elevating the president's structure skyward. This juncture required Hoban's precise sketches to solidify into sturdy enclosures, calling for a blend of exacting skill and brute force that strained all involved. The primary resource, Aquia Creek sandstone, originated from pits in Stafford County, Virginia, about 40 miles southward of the budding capital. The selection made sense. The material was fairly pliable, allowing cutters to fashion it with less effort than tougher granite. Supplies abounded in the needed volume. Above all, waterway access simplified transport. The pits bordered accessible waterways. Huge slabs of stone were loaded onto flatboats and transported along the Potomac up to the building location. Absent this waterway, the primitive, rutted paths of the period couldn't have withstood the enormous bulk and mass required for a structure so grand. The path for each slab, from the jagged quarry face to its place in a completed wall, involved numerous hands across hazardous phases. At the quarries, a combination of paid workers and enslaved men borrowed from local estates wielded mallets, chisels, and metal pry bars to fracture the rock along its inherent lines, freeing crude chunks that might tip the scales at hundreds of pounds or heavier. These segments were then shifted onto the boats via timber derricks, pulleys, and plenty of hollering, with every hoist posing. Dangers like a line breaking or a slab slipping, potentially smashing anyone nearby. The voyage northward along the river might span days, influenced by breezes, water flow, and tidal shifts. Upon arriving at the docks in Georgetown, plenty of the stones showed nicked corners or fine fractures. Prior to integration into the executive residence's walls, they required further refinement, smoothing, evening out, and, occasionally, excising flawed areas entirely. This additional effort demanded extra manpower, extended timelines, and heightened chances of loss should a compromised piece give way amid the framework. When a slab finally made it to the site, its true makeover commenced. Expert masons, often immigrants from Ireland and Scotland, versed in Georgian methods, assumed control, employing mallets, carving tools, and the precision born of long practice in every strike. They refined those jagged forms into ashlar, the precise, block-like units that impart the executive mansion's serene, symmetrical appearance. Shaping one slab could consume hours of focused labor, chipping away surplus material, honing edges, verifying alignment with a ruler, and polishing the exposed surface to align with the specifications in Hoban's blueprints. Mistakes were unforgivable. A block sawn too briefly or narrowly couldn't be mended. It had to be scrapped, squandering all prior toil. Meanwhile, separate teams managed the crucial unseen element uniting the edifice. Lime mortar. Creating it involved a rigorous procedure. Laborers fired limestone in kilns under fierce temperatures for days on end, then cautiously hydrated the resulting quicklime with water to form a workable sludge. The recipe had to be exact. Excess lime risked contraction and fissures upon curing. Insufficient amounts left it too frail to support the weight of masonry walls. Expert applicators combined the hydrated lime with aggregate and moisture right before deployment, aware that the blend would harden in mere hours and couldn't be saved for later. Erecting the walls proceeded at a measured, painstaking pace. Layers of prepared ashlar were stacked one upon the other. Every row demanded dead-level placement before the next could follow. Craftsmen used plumb bobs and bubble levels to ensure upright and even alignments. They knew well that minor deviations at the base would compound higher up, jeopardizing the entire framework's integrity. Timber frameworks ascended alongside the masonry, secured by cords and frequently repositioned. Crews hauled stones via inclined planes or hoisted them with pulley systems, maneuvering each into place through barked commands and roughened palms. The labor adapted to the elements rather than halting for them. Potomac summers delivered sweltering humidity, swarms of bugs, and harsh reflections from the light-colored rock. Colder months unleashed biting gusts that chilled hands to the bone and imperiled new mortar if the chill set in abruptly. Advancement hinged on factors beyond the climate, too. Budget shortfalls hampered material acquisitions. Scarcities of trained hands compelled ongoing rearrangements of duties. Compared to today's efficiency, the tempo felt agonizingly sluggish. Days of exertion might advance the walls by just inches. Still, incrementally the form took shape. Slowly, the elegant Georgian outlines materialized against the horizon. The southern front developed initially, featuring uniform gaps for panes and a middle area set aside for an eventual colonnade. What once was a crude mound beside a marshy shoreline now displayed tangible evidence that the lofty visions drafted on paper in Philadelphia were materializing in enduring rock. Each bit of that advancement, every stone positioned and seam sealed, rested solely on the individuals performing the heaving, carving, and blending. To grasp the true price of the executive mansion, beyond finances, beyond diplomatic deals, one must examine those hands in detail. And the starkly varied existences of the men whose efforts elevated these barriers. The team that lifted the executive mansion from the Potomac silt, captured in one bustling worksite every paradox of the nascent United States. During the 1790s, a typical workday revealed a distinct pecking order among the workers. Skilled master builders earning top wages, along with journeymen aiming to advance and enslaved laborers whose earnings funneled directly to their owners, collaborated on erecting a structure symbolizing democratic rule. Leading the group were the expertly trained European artisans, particularly the stonemasons and carpenters whose expertise proved irreplaceable. A significant number hailed from Ireland, Scotland, and England, lured by prospects of better compensation and greater chances than available in their native lands. James Hoban maintained strong connections within the Irish construction networks and drew talent extensively from Charleston and various other ports where Irish laborers had taken root. These experts commanded impressive pay, typically ranging from $1 to $2 daily, supplemented by lodging and meals, with their signatures recurring frequently in the commissioner's financial ledgers. Colin Williamson, the Scottish stonemason, directing most of the outer facade work. Philip Hart and John Sheehan, Irish woodworkers who crafted the interior framing. Ranking underneath were journeymen and trainees, individuals honing their skills or lacking the standing to command premium fees. Their daily take might range from 50 to 75 cents. Nevertheless, it offered a solid livelihood, capable of sustaining households and eventually enabling promotion to master level. The commissioners exerted considerable effort to draw in these talents, running ads in mid-Atlantic newspapers and highlighting reliable jobs on a venture of profound national significance. Despite such initiatives, maintaining a complete crew remained an ongoing challenge. The site's isolation in the capital, the oppressive heat, and the pull of positions in established, more livable urban centers forced constant rivalry for manpower. This ongoing deficit steered the commissioners toward a familiar recourse among Virginia and Maryland landowners, the use of bound labor. Gradually, they relied more on borrowing enslaved individuals from local estates. Owners entered agreements to provide their human assets for periods of a month, a season, or a full year. The commissioners compensated the proprietors. The actual laborers got only minimal sustenance and housing in return. Official documents captured this arrangement in stark factual terms. Remittances to Charles Digges for 5 Negro men over 1 year. Funds to Not Young for slave hires and comparable notations naming estate holders while omitting the identities of those toiling. These bound workers shouldered the site's most grueling, filthiest, and riskiest tasks. They extracted and transported rock, prepared cement, lugged supplies onto frameworks, excavated runoff channels, and removed brush and roots. Certain ones possessed genuine proficiency. Records reference enslaved woodworkers, masons, and even stone experts. However, even when their abilities equaled those of paid hands, they were undervalued in compensation, with all proceeds still directed to their masters. An individual dragging massive stones amid the sweltering Washington summers, clad in scant garb and flimsy footwear, subsisting on bargain-priced provisions rather than nourishing fare, endured hardships that would challenge today's building teams, despite superior equipment and protections. Proximity in labor did not blur the divide between unbound and chained workers. Rather, it accentuated that boundary. Certain free hands grumbled about the enslaved presence, claiming it undercut their earnings and weakened their leverage for improved deals. Owners, for their part, viewed their charges as mere assets, even amid this civic endeavor, voicing sharp protests over injuries or illnesses and insisting on reimbursements for impaired productivity. The commissioners navigated this tangle, resolving conflicts, addressing proprietors' grievances, and striving to retain sufficient personnel amid illnesses, escapes, or outright quits under the brutal regime. Though the administration prided itself on meticulous documentation, bound laborers frequently vanished into near invisibility in the formal archives. Unbound workers showed up with complete identities and specialties, paid to John Davis for masonry services. Bound men surfaced as mere groupings, Negro hire, slave labor, or occasionally a lone given name linked to an owner's tally. Decades of exhausting toil on the president's residence might condense into one terse entry. Their physical efforts transformed Hoban's blueprints into solid masonry. But the administrative machinery stripped them down to faceless expenditures. It required several generations for scholars to undertake the painstaking task of drawing these souls from obscurity, piecing together fragmented mentions, verifying accounts and correspondence, and reclaiming fragments of the identities and experiences of those who constructed America's iconic residence while stripped of the elemental liberties it ostensibly embodied. Come the fall of 1800, the president's house lingered in an irritating state of incompletion. Circumstances, however, brooked no delay. It needed to welcome its inaugural occupant. The agreement that had kept Philadelphia as the interim capital for a decade had run its course, forcing the federal government to relocate to the emerging city along the Potomac, whether fully prepared or not. As his contentious one-term presidency drew to a close, John Adams faced the odd task of settling into a home that remained largely a building zone. What greeted the Adamses deviated in several respects from Hobon's original blueprint. The outer structure stood complete, its Aquia Creek sandstone facade lending an imposing stature to the site on its modest elevation. The roof had at last been secured, shielding the interior from the elements. Internally, however, conditions were rudimentary at best. Just 6 rooms boasted plastering and basic habitability. Stairways remained incomplete. The intended stately entryway at the north side lacked its portico, compelling guests to ascend provisional wooden stairs. The surrounding property resembled a chaotic workshop, cluttered with piles of lumber, mounds of clay, shattered rock, and laborers' shelters, far from an ideal backdrop for official gatherings. Nevertheless, Adams departed Philadelphia in early November, enduring the jolting journey southward as carts transported his belongings and government documents. He reached the president's residence on November 1st, 1800, marking him as the inaugural leader to rest beneath its fresh covering. His spouse, Abigail, lingered in Massachusetts for weeks to handle domestic matters. That inaugural evening, Adams penned a letter to her, blending optimism with apprehension, including the phrase, destined to achieve legendary status. Underscore, quote, _1, Abigail's arrival in mid-November brought a starkly pragmatic response, quite unlike her husband's invocation. In correspondence with loved ones, she detailed the relentless hassle of makeshift living. The residence stayed perpetually chilly. Merely a few hearths functioned adequately to draw smoke. Wood for fires proved both rare and costly in the nascent capital, demanding meticulous effort and anxiety just to achieve minimal warmth. Beyond the dwelling, the area offered scant amenities. Washington City amounted to isolated structures amid sloppy fields. With the seat of power as raw as the executive mansion and limited commerce or conveniences nearby, Abigail's starkest adaptation centered on the East Room, the vast chamber envisioned for lavish soirees and formal occasions. In truth, its unfinished walls and coarse floors rendered it unfit for ceremony. Thus, she repurposed it as an enormous, drying area. The expansive dimensions and airflow suited it well for suspending garments, and before long, the venue for hosting notables brimmed with wet fabrics and apparel draped across improvised cords. The scene lingers vividly, the inaugural household's intimate attire and linens fluttering in the breeze, in a space where the fledgling nation had envisioned refined gatherings and opulent rituals. Within this partially built framework, the Adams domestic team labored to sustain everyday functions. Help carried water manually from adjacent sources, as no water system existed. Meals were prepared in the lower-level kitchen, using open flames and heated pots, then transported via tight passages to the living quarters. Given the scarcity of completed areas, formal hospitality unfolded in confined, inelegant spots that hardly suited a leader's duties in welcoming envoys or entertaining lawmakers. In essence, the Adams era in the fresh capital unfolded amid a veneer of orderly disarray, with governance operations compressed into the constraints of an active worksite. For the family, this trying period proved brief. Defeated in the hard-fought 1800 contest by Thomas Jefferson, once a comrade, now a fierce rival, Adams occupied the incomplete president's house for roughly 4 months, from November 1800 through March 1801. Smarting from the setback, he reportedly slipped away from Washington before daybreak on the inauguration morning, returning to Massachusetts and deliberately skipping Jefferson's ceremony. The responsibility of elevating the president's house from a scarcely functional husk toward its envisioned grandeur shifted not to Adams, but to the individual who had subtly submitted an uncredited proposal in the initial contest. Thomas Jefferson, his sophisticated eye for design and profound inner conflicts, would indelibly shape the structure and the ethical trade-offs embedded in its finalization. Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in March 1801, armed with firm opinions on design, Republican ideals, and presidential lifestyle. Unlike John Adams, who had merely endured the incomplete abode, Jefferson viewed it as an opportunity to mold the edifice to his preferences. Yet Jefferson's time residing in the executive mansion would reveal, more starkly than nearly any other administration, the vast chasm between the nation's lofty principles and its everyday truths. Long before he assumed its stewardship, Jefferson held firm ideas about the presidential residence. During the earlier design contest, he had discreetly entered his own unsigned entry, a restrained Palladian villa that reflected his deep appreciation for the style. As chief executive now, though, he inhabited not that elegant retreat, but James Hoban's sturdy Georgian edifice, which he quietly deemed somewhat uninspiring. Nevertheless, Jefferson prized utility above all. Rather than demolish the existing structure, he targeted key modifications that allowed him to imprint his vision without dismantling the whole. His primary expansions included the east and west terraces, modest colonnaded extensions projecting from both flanks of the central block. On drawings, they appeared straightforward. In execution, they addressed multiple challenges simultaneously. These platforms concealed stables, storage spaces, and utility zones behind refined column facades. They infused the residence with the classical elements Jefferson believed essential for a Republican edifice, and they connected the core dwelling to its support facilities, avoiding the clutter of isolated auxiliary structures dotting the property. To Jefferson, these appendages demonstrated that aesthetics and function could harmonize seamlessly. Within the walls, he directed efforts toward chambers that, in Adams's era, had remained scarcely functional. He managed the acquisition and arrangement of furniture, frequently selecting items in the French manner he had grown fond of while serving as envoy to France. The expansive East Room, once pressed into service by Abigail Adams for drying clothes, remained incomplete throughout his full tenure. Jefferson showed scant enthusiasm for lavish public events. He favored intimate, manageable venues. Rather than hasten the creation of a lavish reception hall, he prioritized the areas central to his routine and duties. These encompassed a robustly equipped library, dedicated writing spaces for correspondence and scientific tools, and eating areas tailored for the private suppers that evolved into his preferred method of political engagement. Jefferson applied equal diligence to the surrounding grounds. An avid horticulturist and agronomist, he guided the introduction of plantings and the design of green spaces. He envisioned the presidential estate's environs as a blend of functional farm and refined gentleman's domain. Not a mere display of decoration, but a site where industriousness itself embodied Republican values. Garden beds for vegetables sprang up. Trial plantings established themselves. Gradually, the raw, muddied build site transformed into a thoughtfully tended vista. Yet under this polished exterior lurked a truth Jefferson could scarcely reconcile. The tasks of completing and polishing the presidential abode continued to burden enslaved hands disproportionately. He transported enslaved individuals from Monticello to staff the house as chefs, attendants, and manual workers. They upheld his domestic operations in Washington, even as statutes deemed them his possessions. The irony cut deep. The man who penned that all men are created equal presided over an official residence partly operated by individuals subject to commerce like goods. Construction efforts across Jefferson's pair of terms echoed the troubling precedent established at the outset. The terraces he incorporated, the terrain he directed, the inner detailing he oversaw, all depended on a blended labor pool. Paid artisans received compensation and, in principle, the freedom to depart. Enslaved toilers lacked such options. Among those bound individuals, some possessed exceptional expertise, but compensation for their efforts flowed to their enslavers. Their exertions enabled Jefferson's enhancements, even as the institution confining them derided the principles the structure ostensibly symbolized. Jefferson recognized this dissonance. In his correspondence, he decried bondage as an ethical failing and a peril to the democracy. Yet in practice, he relied upon it persistently, augmenting his personal estates while decrying its perils in writing. That internal conflict, evident in his rhetoric, more pronounced in his conduct, manifested tangibly within the president's house. This was an edifice intended to symbolize legal parity, sustained by a pecking order so lopsided that certain laborers there held no legal claim to their own persons. The terraces, plantings, and meticulously planned interiors that Jefferson introduced would persist beyond his presidency, influencing how subsequent leaders interacted with the space. But the ethical concessions embedded in the building under his watch would linger as well. They embedded themselves silently in the masonry, the utility passages, the recollections of those compelled to toil there, poised for later eras to confront them forthrightly. Despite the risk to the era's reassuring legends, and every bit of this enhancement, every deliberate molding Jefferson gave to the president's house, stood on the brink of the severest trial imaginable. Not from partisan opposition or fiscal constraints, but from marauding soldiers and raging fire. The conflict known as the War of 1812, a frequently underappreciated confrontation between the United States and Britain, stretched beyond 2 years without a decisive victor. That changed in the summer of 1814, when British tactics took a decisive turn. With Napoleon's forces vanquished in Europe, seasoned soldiers became available, prompting Britain to target the U.S. capital head-on. This strategic assault aimed to shame the fledgling nation and extract more favorable terms for peace. The president's residence, embodying the essence of American leadership, stood poised to suffer as a prominent target of this vengeful retaliation. By August 1814, troops commanded by Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn had come ashore in Maryland, advancing steadily on Washington. The hastily assembled and disorganized American resistance crumbled during the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th. President James Madison, who ventured to the battlefield to observe the action, marking him as the sole incumbent president to experience active combat firsthand, watched as militia forces fled in disarray against the well-trained British lines. As the protectors dispersed, the path to the capital stood unguarded. Madison raced back to the president's house amid a scene of utter chaos. Government workers bolted with armloads of records. Residents rushed to flee. Within the house itself, Dolly Madison orchestrated one of the most celebrated salvaging operations in White House lore. Composed amid the encroaching enemy, she supervised the bundling of vital state papers and, even more iconically, demanded the rescue of Gilbert Stuart's full-body portrait of George Washington. The artwork hung securely fastened to the wall in the state dining room. To avoid delays in dismantling it properly, her staff broke the frame and sliced the canvas loose. This bold choice, amid cultural priorities, executed as enemy forces neared, cemented Dolly Madison's enduring legacy in U.S. history. Though just one episode in a cascade of misfortunes that day, as the Madisons forded the Potomac and moved westward, The British advanced nearly unchallenged into Washington that evening of August 24th. The events that unfolded at the President's house have acquired a mythic aura, yet the essential facts remain thoroughly recorded. British commanders, spearheaded by Admiral Cockburn, stepped into the vacant mansion and discovered the state dining room still set for dinner. It's unclear if the spread anticipated the Madisons' return, or was simply overlooked in the panic to escape. True to form, the officers, ravenous after battle, took seats and devoured the meal. Lounging at the U.S. leaders' table, they allegedly raised glasses to British triumphs while polishing off the forsaken feast. The act blended necessity with symbolism, a pointed jab at American authority right before the arson commenced. From there, they turned to wrecking the structure. Their intent wasn't mere pillaging, but a targeted assault on official operations. Troops hauled furnishings into heaps, tossed in volumes, documents, drapes, and any flammable items at hand, then ignited blazes across the interior. Over 14 years, the building had accumulated wooden pieces, chairs, paneling, doors, rugs, that served as ideal kindling. The Aquia Creek sandstone exterior, so painstakingly constructed, resisted the blaze, yet the contents within were overwhelmingly timber-based. Flooring, stairs, rafters, sashes. As the fire took hold, the inside blazed intensely. The rising temperature caused windows to burst, supports to fracture, and chunks of the upper levels to plunge into the cellar. That evening, a fierce summer squall swept across the city, the sort typical along the Potomac. Torrents of water cascaded through the scorched ceiling. Certain reports indicate this deluge possibly spared the house total obliteration, quenching flames that might otherwise have demolished it entirely. Nevertheless, by daybreak on August 25th, the President's house lay in devastation. Viewed externally, the edifice endured, its stone facade scorched and fissured by the intense heat. Internally, however, it was gutted. Steps had given way, levels had caved in. The roof had vanished in large part. Jefferson's crafted terraces bore scars. The home's possessions had been ransacked, demolished, or incinerated. The grounds, once envisioned by Jefferson as a democratic domain, lay churned into sludge. The British occupied Washington for about 24 hours, during which they torched the Capitol, the Treasury, and various other federal sites, before pulling back. They abandoned a battered metropolis and a rattled young country. America had entered the war to safeguard its autonomy, only to confront the reality of its heartland seized and its premier landmarks left as charred remnants. Still, amid the wreckage, the narrative persisted. No credible suggestion emerged to forsake the President's house. Instead, a different dilemma arose. As the country moved forward with Reconstruction, a pivotal dilemma arose. Restore the old residence exactly as it was, or seize the devastation as an opportunity to redesign it, and thereby redefine the very symbol of American leadership. In the immediate aftermath of the British assault, with lingering haze rising from the President's dwelling and the city in comparable disarray, Congress confronted a stark challenge. Was Washington truly fit to remain the nation's capital? Certain lawmakers contended that the blaze had laid bare the folly of initially situating the government's core in an isolated, vulnerable marshland. They advocated relocating to a proven urban center such as Philadelphia or New York, or even pushing westward to align with the growing settlements. Counter-arguments emphasized that deserting the scorched capital at this juncture would grant Britain a triumph surpassing any military success. Quote 2. Opponents declared it would signal that the fledgling democracy had faltered in resolve. This perspective ultimately prevailed. The choice was finalized: remain in place and revive the city. With that resolved, a subsequent inquiry emerged without delay. Who would oversee the revival of the President's residence? The selection blended utility and significance. James Hoban, the initial designer, was summoned to resurrect his masterpiece from near ruin. Now in his late 50s, Hoban had rooted himself in the capital, entangled in various design and construction ventures. Witnessing his crowning achievement stripped to a hollowed-out frame undoubtedly stung. Yet he embraced the role, driven by a blend of vocational honor and inner resolve. His aim extended beyond mere fixes. He intended to demonstrate that both the structure and the country could rebound from catastrophe. The initial step involved a thorough evaluation of the surviving elements. Through the cold months spanning late 1814 to early 1815, Hoban and his crew meticulously examined the wreckage. The outer sandstone walls, despite soot-blackened and frail in places, remained structurally solid, attesting to the quality of the foundational stonework. The Jefferson-era east and west terraces had endured, bearing reparable harm. The interior, by contrast, was utterly devastated. Flooring, stairs, roof beams, dividing walls, window casings, doorways, all the timber that had transformed the rocky enclosure into a livable space had been consumed by flames. The path forward demanded far more than patching. It required a complete overhaul of the internals, rivaling the effort of erecting the edifice anew. Lawmakers allocated budget for the endeavor, initially modest, then augmented as expenses sharpened into focus, and rebuilding commenced vigorously come spring 1815. The labor pool echoed past efforts. Irish and Scottish masons reappeared to manage the stone elements. Local woodworkers addressed the fresh skeletal framework and detailing. Enslaved workers, drawn once more from adjacent Maryland and Virginia estates, handled the bulk of the strenuous and basic tasks. Several original builders returned, 2 decades grayer, but bearing crucial recollections of the initial assembly process. In that time, absent reliable duplication and archiving of plans, such first-hand expertise bridged voids left by missing or ruined sketches and directives. A critical decision in the revival hinged on the facade's stone. The conflagration had blemished the Aquia Creek sandstone, rendering it mottled and more susceptible to erosion. Soot streaked the surfaces, while extreme temperatures had scarred and textured them unevenly. Certain blocks had fractured, necessitating swaps. Still, dismantling and re-erecting the full shell proved unfeasible and fiscally out of reach. Hoban suggested an alternative. Apply white paint across the entire exterior. Beyond aesthetics, this robust coating of lead-infused whitewash would protect the rock, curb deterioration, and yield a smooth, uniform finish that masked the severest burn marks. Moreover, it altered the distant silhouette. Rather than the subtle, variegated sandstone tones, the edifice now gleamed as a solid, luminous white mass. This move subtly cemented the building's enduring character. Even prior to the Inferno, a few had informally dubbed it the White House, owing to the stone's inherent pallor. Post-Hoban's overhaul, with the deliberate whitening, the moniker proved inescapable. The vivid white frontage contrasted sharply with Washington's sparse urban backdrop and was visible from miles away over the expansive plains. Though Theodore Roosevelt wouldn't formalize White House as the official title until 1901, from 1817 the unmistakable sight rendered it indelible. Revamping the interiors afforded Hoban an uncommon do-over. 20 years of occupancy had exposed strengths and shortcomings. He capitalized on this to refine stairway layouts for smoother movement, adjust spatial dimensions, and incorporate contemporary amenities feasible by 1815. Enhanced heating setups, refined window arrangements, and superior interior details were among the upgrades. However, Hoban avoided transforming the structure into something entirely new. The fundamental ratios, core floor plan, and enduring Georgian essence remained true to his initial concept. Visitors familiar with the residence prior to the blaze would have no trouble identifying it once the renovations concluded. Fueled by a bruised sense of national honor and a drive to demonstrate endurance globally, the restoration proceeded at a speed that astonished observers of the original construction's deliberate progress. Come fall 1817, the executive residence stood prepared for occupancy anew. That November, President James Monroe and his household settled in, marking nearly 17 years since John Adams had first occupied the space. Monroe entered a dwelling that, in numerous respects, surpassed the version Adams encountered. The inner spaces boasted greater sophistication, the pathways flowed more logically, and the pale outer surface unified the design with unprecedented precision. Now the edifice conveyed a distinct narrative. The Republic could face assaults, even incineration, yet it would endure. It would restore itself, and in a manner visible to all nations. The executive residence had endured its fiery ordeal as the 19th century progressed. However, fresh challenges, evolving technologies, a burgeoning bureaucracy, changing societal norms, and the relentless toll of years would repeatedly strain the structure, evolving a fresh palace into a weathered emblem of the nation, demanding ongoing attention. Following Hoban's overhaul, the executive residence gradually transitioned from a modest official abode to the form we know in our time. These alterations extended beyond aesthetics. They mirrored an enlarging country, a broadening executive role, and emerging innovations that subtly reshaped the residence's operations, all while its pristine, neoclassical exterior evoked enduring solidity. The key structural expansions occurred in the early 1800s, specifically during the 1820s and early 1830s, as Hoban, continuing his role as the site's designer and overseer, at last implemented elements from his 1792 blueprint. The standout features were the north and south porticos. The south portico emerged first, finishing in 1824 and forming the famous arched colonnade on the garden facade, and graceful half-circle upheld by soaring Ionic pillars. This addition provided essential cover for formal arrivals and, equally vital, endowed the residence with a dramatic, theatrical front overlooking the landscape. That elegant arc, destined to frame innumerable images and films, stemmed originally from Hoban's long-postponed notion, now realized. The north portico arrived in 1829, bearing a contrasting style. Rather than a flowing arc, it adopted a square portico, direct and service-oriented. This approach fit perfectly. The northern aspect overlooked the urban expanse and handled the bulk of guest entries, prioritizing utility alongside visual appeal. Collectively, these porticos fulfilled the balanced, stately outline Hoban had drafted almost 3 decades before, establishing the residence's enduring profile across eras. Not all welcomed these modifications. Detractors argued that the porticos rendered the executive residence overly continental, resembling a minor royal seat in a land that valued its break from crowns. Yet by the 1820s, the country's assurance had strengthened. Anxieties that extra pillars might crown the president as monarch held less sway than in the Republic's tenuous beginnings. Within, the structure evolved ceaselessly. Each presidential term imprinted its mark on the chambers: fresh furnishings, refreshed upholstery, altered wall hues, additional artwork to fill voids. Functional demands evolved, too. The East Room, left incomplete or merely partially done across several terms and once repurposed as Abigail Adams's laundry area, at last became a proper venue for official gatherings under Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. Thereafter, it aligned more fully with its planned function as host to major public occasions. Innovations in technology crept in more subtly, yet reshaped routines more profoundly than any decorative update. The initial major advance was piped water in the 1830s. Conduits delivered water indoors, eliminating the endless task of lugging cumbersome pails from external spigots and sources up and down levels. By modern measures, the setup was rudimentary. But for the inhabitants and staff, it marked a profound shift. Washing grew simpler and less burdensome. Culinary operations streamlined and general cleanliness advanced markedly. During the 1840s in President James K. Polk's era, gas illumination started supplanting the unsteady glow of tapers and lanterns. Pipes carrying gas were snaked across the residence, while innovative fittings emerged in prominent spaces, complete with their translucent covers and inviting radiance that reshaped the way evenings unfolded within the grand estate. Still, for quite some time, gas illumination shared the stage with conventional sources. The expense of gas meant it wasn't viable everywhere, leaving numerous areas dependent on age-old oil lamps and candles. Over almost 40 years, the gentle whisper and amber gleam of gas lamps shaped the essence of nighttime in the White House. The subsequent advancement arrived toward the close of the 1800s. In 1891, amid Benjamin Harrison's tenure, electricity was introduced across the entire structure. Compared to the rest of the nation, the White House lagged behind as an innovator. Certain sections of Washington had already benefited from electric illumination for about 10 years. Retrofitting a dwelling, never intended for wiring and controls, proved a massive endeavor. Cables for electricity needed to navigate dense stonework, and outdated supports, outlets, and devices had to be selected and mounted, and the fresh setup integrated with the lingering gas infrastructure, given the widespread doubt about this emerging power source. Accounts suggest the Harrison household regarded the innovation with genuine wariness. Contemporary tales recounted their reluctance to touch the controls, fearing jolts from the strange mechanism. Occasionally, bulbs remained lit overnight, merely because nobody dared to flip them off. Thus, the residents stepped into the era of electricity, though its residents required adjustment to keep pace. Warming the interior traced a comparable route of incremental progress. The initial hearths, charming in depictions and artwork, proved woefully inadequate in reality, offering scant warmth against the leaky drafts and the city's soggy, bone-chilling winters. Starting in the 1850s and advancing piecemeal thereafter, steam-based heating with radiators was incorporated. Furnaces in the lower level circulated heated water and vapor through an intricate piping network, culminating in heaters positioned beside walls and beneath sills. This unobtrusive transformation, hidden from guests, rendered the home vastly more suitable as a perpetual dwelling. Nevertheless, every one of these enhancements, verandas, plumbing for water, gas conduits, electric circuits, and heating ducts, had been superimposed on a framework that was steadily aging. The executive's abode no longer stood as a pristine emblem emerging from the soil. Instead, it evolved into a maturing edifice, grappling with expansion strains. Expected to accommodate greater numbers, advanced machinery, and heightened demands, far exceeding the visions of its initial creators. Entering the opening years of the 1900s, the presidential residence had endured non-stop occupancy for over a century. It had housed successive first families, entertained diplomatic banquets and formal gatherings, and borne the routine burdens of governmental operations. Such prolonged activity, built upon 19th-century foundations, stretched the construction well past its originator's expectations. Externally, the pale exterior retained its serene, sturdy appearance. Internally, however, the edifice displayed troubling indicators that it was on the verge of disintegration. At root, the issue stemmed from structural engineering. James Hoban's foundational blueprint, solid for its era, wasn't engineered to withstand the stresses and tremors from 100 years of expansions and unrelenting activity. A series of commanders-in-chief had excavated fresh stairwells into ancient partitions, appended chambers, fitted lifts, and burdened the place with weighty contemporary apparatus. Each modification, enhanced convenience on upper levels while subtly eroding the foundational framework below. By the 1900s, countless timber supports and girders, including those from the late 1700s rebuild, faced grave peril. Plaster overheads drooped in ominous arcs. Surfaces shifted and yielded with each step. At East Room performances, attendees sensed the ground quivering, while overhead fixtures oscillated noticeably to the rhythm. The venue continued to stage elegant affairs, yet in terms of integrity, it resembled a weary tenement more than an unassailable landmark. During his term from 1901 to 1909, Theodore Roosevelt initiated the era's initial substantial refurbishment. His efforts, however, targeted operations and spatial arrangement over profound foundational fixes. He established the West Wing to relocate administrative spaces from the private family zones, reconfiguring the facility's utilization. This adjustment eased certain everyday strains on the primary structure, yet it failed to address the deep-seated frailties in the aged timbers and supports. Subsequent leaders voiced complaints regarding the premise's state, but a comprehensive interior overhaul appeared unfeasible. Where might an incumbent chief executive reside? How would official functions proceed if the central residence were reduced to exposed frameworks? The White House had grown indispensable to the ceremonies of U.S. governance, rendering any closure impractical. Consequently, issues were noted, assessments documented, and then shelved as the deterioration progressed unnoticed. The crisis peaked during Harry Truman's leadership. In 1948, technicians conducting a standard review uncovered a terrifying revelation. The core was perilously near total failure. The alert, in a grim twist, bordered on the absurdly humorous. When Margaret Truman's piano leg suddenly pierced right through the sitting room floor, it served as a stark alert. Upon further examination by structural specialists, it emerged that numerous support beams had ceased to bear the weight of the upper levels effectively. In certain spots, it was merely layers of plaster, paint, and sheer routine that were preventing collapse rather than the wooden framework itself. Over the years, the White House had been teetering perilously on the edge of catastrophe. True to his straightforward approach, Truman authorized a thorough demolition and overhaul of the entire interior. Far from a mere facelift, this undertaking amounted to an almost complete overhaul. By 1949, the Trumans relocated temporarily to Blair House on the opposite side of Pennsylvania Avenue, allowing teams to launch one of the grandest restoration endeavors in U.S. history. Within the enduring stone exterior, every element was stripped away. Laborers methodically took apart the interiors, tagging and safeguarding doors, fireplaces, wall panels, and ornamental plasterwork for precise reinstallation. Underneath the foundation, excavators created additional subterranean levels to accommodate contemporary utilities. Surrounded by the preserved outer walls, builders installed a comprehensive steel skeleton, essentially fashioning a fresh, up-to-date edifice within the confines of the venerable stone enclosure. As partitions were breached and levels dismantled, the residence started revealing its concealed tales. Engraved on aged timbers were etchings and autographs from the artisans involved in the initial erection and Hoban's restoration following the fire. These included personal names, timestamps, and hastily inscribed notes. A great many of these individuals had faded from documented annals. Their inscriptions in the timber stood as the sole evidence of their presence at the location. In the underground excavations, archaeologists and crew members unearthed remnants from the estate's prior eras, shards of shattered ceramics, abandoned implements, remnants of early construction substances. Every discovery contributed a small fragment to the intricate narrative of the executive residence's construction and occupancy over well more than 100 years. This overhaul extended beyond mere structural rescue. It unveiled the accumulated strata of heritage, woven into its very fabric. The project spanned almost 4 years and exceeded $5 million in expense, an enormous outlay by standards of the era. Upon the family's homecoming in 1952, they entered what amounted to, functionally, an entirely renovated dwelling concealed beneath its antique stone visage. The chambers were meticulously reconstructed to echo their period authenticity. Yet, concealed behind the vintage woodwork and elaborate ceiling details lurked mid-20th century reinforcements of steel, cement, and advanced infrastructure. At last, the structure could reliably accommodate sizable gatherings, integrate current telecom setups, and provide the necessary warmth, water systems, and power suited to the demands of that post-war existence. To the average observer, the White House appeared largely unchanged. Beneath its recognizable facade, however, profound changes had occurred. Nevertheless, even while restorers refurbished the formal salons and private quarters, a more profound inquiry arose. Which narratives were being safeguarded through this meticulous revival? And which contributions of toil and existence had been subtly omitted from the sanctioned chronicle of the nation's iconic residence? For close to 200 years since its founding, the prevailing account of the White House centered predominantly on chief executives, designers, and select notable independent builders. The bound individuals who contributed to its erection and operations were, at most, peripheral presences, and often wholly omitted. Such omission was no oversight. It mirrored an intentional lens on U.S. heritage that averted gaze from the harshest realities concealed within its most celebrated icons. Unearthing the identities and experiences of those bound laborers has marked a pivotal evolution in narrating the site's legacy. Dedicated initiatives to chronicle their roles commenced principally during the 1970s and 1980s, as scholars influenced by emerging social historiography revisited archival sources with novel inquiries. The superintendent's financial records from the 1790s and initial 1800s, housed in the National Archives, proved indispensable. Line by line, these volumes recorded disbursements to owners for the rental of Negro laborers. The entries regarded these workers as leased assets, devoid of humanity. Yet they nonetheless established a key truth. Bound labor was no marginal element. It formed the core of the executive mansion's development right from its inception. The subsequent challenge proved more arduous, transitioning from these impersonal notations to actual identities and personal histories. This pursuit evolved into a form of archival sleuthing. Scholars compared estate accounts, correspondence, public notices, population tallies, and any available document that could yield a lead. A transaction with Daniel Carroll for the use of Negro Tom might align with estate files noting a bound woodworker by that name. A notation for the rental of 5 Negro males could link, via supplementary papers, to particular persons in the vicinity, recognized for expertise in stonework or woodworking. Gradually, with meticulous effort, given names acquired occupations, places of origin, and snippets of life details. As details emerged more clearly, it grew evident that enslaved laborers had performed nearly every kind of task essential to erecting the residence. They extracted and transported rock, felled trees, baked bricks, prepared cement, and endured the unyielding physical demands that accompany any major building endeavor. Yet, the investigation revealed more than mere manual toil. Certain enslaved individuals possessed exceptional expertise. Among them were skilled woodworkers, masons, and stonecutters, whose work rivaled that of their free counterparts. People such as Philip Reed, an enslaved metalworker, destined to contribute significantly to forging the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol dome, exemplified a broader cohort of proficient enslaved artisans whose abilities proved vital to monumental construction efforts, despite legal systems stripping them of fundamental humanity. The ledgers also suggested the profound human toll concealed within the masonry and finishes. Building in the 1790s posed hazards to all involved, but enslaved workers confronted those perils without safeguards. A hired worker, heard on sight, could depart, insist on better terms, or decline to continue. An enslaved person lacked those choices. He was compelled to persist until physically unable. The financial records occasionally noted reimbursements to owners for laborers who perished or suffered lasting harm, treating them as depreciated assets rather than acknowledging irreplaceable lives. The exact number of men felled by tumbling rocks, maimed by failing platforms, or afflicted by harsh exposures near the sodden construction zone remains elusive. If a mishap spared the owner's wallet, it frequently escaped documentation altogether. Scholars discovered further that the White House's dependence on enslaved hands persisted long after the final supports were dismantled. Across the antebellum era, these workers sustained the structure's operations on a daily basis. They prepared meals in the kitchens, stoked hearths and lit fixtures, maintained the grounds and outbuildings, and attended to duties within the living quarters. Leaders from slave-holding regions arrived in Washington, accompanied by their personal enslaved attendants, deepening the irony of the setting. Individuals were purchased, possessed, and commanded within the symbolic residence of a nation professing freedom as its core principle. Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, and similar figures managed presidential affairs while relying on the intimate service of those they held in bondage by law. As these findings seeped into broader consciousness, they reshaped the institution's narrative of its history. In 2016, following persistent efforts from scholars, heirs of the past, and equality campaigners, Michelle Obama publicly underscored that slaves had constructed the White House. For many, hearing this fact articulated from the East Room lectern felt startling, perhaps contentious. Yet it aligned with insights from the archives accumulated over decades. Subsequently, guided visits began to highlight the contributions of enslaved staff more forthrightly. Displays and written materials incorporated their experiences, parallel to those of chief executives and their spouses. A memorial plaque was erected to recognize the enslaved builders who aided in the edifice's creation, rendering their involvement tangible in ways prior eras had suppressed. Today, the task remains incomplete. Countless identities are irretrievably lost. Numerous accounts can only be inferred from fragmentary clues. Nevertheless, the persistent drive to reintegrate these figures into the story transcends scholarly pursuit. It constitutes an essential confrontation with the White House's authentic essence. Not solely the nation's aspirations for self-rule and fairness, but the protracted, agonizing gap between those aspirations and the existences endured by the laborers, men and women alike, whose coerced efforts erected its framework. Unearthing these obscured accounts leads us to ponder the White House's significance in the current era. Not its designed symbolism, but its true embodiment when viewed through its entire, intricate chronicle. The White House operates as three intertwined facets, each carrying unique demands and tensions. Primarily, it stands as a repository of history, safeguarding over 200 years of executive legacy and drawing more than 1 million visitors each year eager to see the chambers where world-shaping choices occurred. Additionally, it serves as an active administrative hub where governmental operations unfold routinely, with employees moving amid irreplaceable heirlooms and digital systems, formal halls, and practical offices. Thirdly, it functions as a genuine residence, where the president's family strives for a measure of normalcy amid unparalleled scrutiny. Still, apart from these practical purposes, the edifice acts as a reflector, casting the nation's profoundest inconsistencies upon its own gaze. The tale of its construction captures the central contradiction of America's origins. A country that championed human rights for everyone, all while upholding the cruel institution of slavery. Intended as a symbol of Republican ideals, The structure rose under the labor of people stripped of the very liberties it was meant to safeguard. Far from a mere philosophical twist, this paradox lives on in the physical material of the edifice, blocks shaped, dragged, and fitted by the hands of individuals reduced to chattel. Today's memorials and recognitions mark vital progress in facing our past, though they fall short of erasing the core discord. It's impossible to rewrite the builders of those initial stones or the harsh terms of their work. We can't reach back through time to free the bound laborers whose toil seeped into the groundwork. Yet we hold the reins on the narrative ahead, whether to keep sidelining their role for a polished myth of visionary leaders and pure principles, or to reckon fully with the stark facts of how this beacon of democracy truly came into being.